Good morning. Thank you for being here. I'm not used to sitting down and doing presentations either, so if I'm fidgeting, it's because I'm normally pacing the room like a game show host. But my name is Mark Ruppel. I'm in from DC from the National Endowment for the Humanities. My background is partially in game design, but a lot of my dissertation work was on experiential education and transmedia storytelling, more specifically, how different platforms talk across each other in order to form coherency and learning and tell a coherent narrative. Right now, though, my day job is at the NEH, where we focus on funding projects in the humanities, and I lead a grant line called Digital Projects for the Public. And I'd feel remiss if I didn't give it a little quick plug here. This is the flagship grant line for the Humanities Endowment, and it's one of the largest in the federal government that funds games. We also fund VR, virtual environments, mobile apps, interpretive websites, transmedia projects, museum content, curated exhibits that might live online, all of the sorts of public engagements that you might see happening partially on the digital humanities side, but we take these things to the level of a film or a radio program or a museum exhibit. We like to go big, we like to go broad, and these are potential projects with real breakthrough. Our next deadline is next June, as a matter of fact, so you've got a good headway if you have anything working. We offer 3 different levels of funding: discovery, prototyping, and production. Discovery grants are usually the most useful to those starting off in the field, as they give you an opportunity to just get some cash infused into the project, to get scholars or content experts in the room with media producers, to winnow down the possibilities for a particular platform, to figure out what's possible in a given content space, and to find out where a project can potentially go. I will stop there. If you're interested in hearing anything more about it, I'm here for the duration of the conference, and I'm happy to talk. I'm also here Wednesday and Thursday doing some meetings. But today we're here to talk about the humanities, writ large and writ small. We do offer a definition on our website, and it's every bit as awkward as the one I'm about to present to you, because the humanities are a contested space, and they're one that's been defined and redefined over time for a number of different purposes, ranging from the politics of certain academic spaces to the actual composition of the disciplines themselves. Media studies, for example, is now being considered as part of the humanities canon. But more traditionally, what we talk about when we talk about the humanities is the study and interpretation of history, literature, philosophy, jurisprudence, language, linguistics, archaeology, comparative religion, ethics, the types of disciplines and domains that deal directly with human experience. And that's just to name a few. And this gets awfully messy for us sometimes at the NEH when we try to define a project and its actual domain and try to figure out where it fits into our grant cycle. Now, the reason why I'm here today, though, is because there's strong evidence that suggests that the humanities and gaming are quite a match. And they match on the level of comprehension, contextualization, and overall learning. Now, there's a great study by Michael Young in 2012. I think the paper was called Our Princess is in Another Castle. It's a meta-analysis of the field of gaming and what's taking place in the classroom and what's sticking. And because it's a meta-analysis, it has the opportunity to traffic in breadth. What this study found, essentially, was that in classrooms that incorporated humanities gaming, comprehension, overall application of learning skills went up substantially. And that's because the humanities are messy. And what I mean by that is that they don't traffic in the same sorts of definite answers, concrete ways of learning about the world that STEM sciences do. They deal in ways of understanding. They don't deal in exactness. So working in the humanities often involves piecing together disparate sources, interpretive argumentation, and exploring how the micro impacts the macro. Or, to put this in words so beautifully and eloquent that they border on profound, taken from Ready Player One, a film that my children are somehow obsessed with, reality is real, folks, and that, folks, is my own addition. So part one, what I want to talk about today is this idea of drawing a magic circle within the humanities. How do we accomplish and build and design for a game space that promotes learning, that promotes understanding, that promotes engagement with the fields that I had just discussed, all the while maintaining some sort of affinity to the historical record? In other words, if things happened, even if that historical record's subject to change and reinterpretation over time, how do we give players a sense of agency in that space? a way of feeling as if they're in control of their own destiny, a way of playing it with cause and effect, contingency, counterfactuality, all of the sorts of things that we know can happen in games. Now, these 3 C's that I mentioned here, you'll hear me drop quite often today: contingency, counterfactuality, contextuality. Those are my shorthand in some ways for describing how the humanities work and how they work well in game spaces. But as I said before, how do you balance this idea of the factual, something that we can point to in the historical record, something we know or have a pretty good sense of happening, with the idea that in learning contexts, counterfactuality, the ability to push back against established facts, to work against chronologies, to fill in the gaps, and actually add your own interpretation of what might have happened, is actually more profound in some ways. How do you design for context and accuracy of environments, places, events, objects, while also allowing for the player to somehow define them and engage in the historical process? Now, historical fidelity, at least visual historical fidelity, is something that's relatively easily accomplished nowadays. So take, for example, the tried and tested example of Assassin's Creed 3, of course. Set during the American Revolution, the game was praised for its accurate settings and details, right down to the brooches like this one that the general is wearing. But as we all know, the work put in by Ubisoft historian Maxime Durand and his team served one primary purpose: to be ignored by the rest of the team, as they presented themselves with this fantastical time travel sci-fi epic about a band of assassins working through some convoluted plot that I've yet to figure out. Now, they really do ignore it at different points, too. And the farcity of it on some level is what makes it work. We have the boundary of a historical space. We see the accurate markers of that space. We see the types of things we might see at a historic site itself, but yet within that space is this defined sense of play. Now, interestingly enough, Ubisoft has a mandate, and they've had one since the 1980s, that really does in some ways, very subtly I think these days, demand that their projects have some kind of learning element to it. This is hard to get your head around when you stare at something like Rabbids, for example. I know. But Valiant Hearts, a game that was produced more recently, in 2014 in fact, has some degree of that process that's been enabled. Inspired by letters from World War I, like Assassin's Creed, the project was praised for its fidelity and its revelation of World War I's causes, starting with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. But the game ran into trouble, though, when it tried its hardest to be most game-like. Many of the players' goals were actually rendered as puzzles to be solved with little to no basis in reality, such as scouring the battlefield for bones to really generate a machine here that produces poison on the battlefield that then runs up to a railroad track where your cohorts are found. Now, it's kind of a miracle I've made it 10 minutes in here without mentioning the game that we most associate with the humanities, or Oregon Trail. And this is actually, I think, an advertisement for the state of Oregon. I couldn't find a gift that actually fit the title screen here. But this is without a doubt the first blockbuster humanities game in a project we've been running now that's been running for close to 40 years now. Debuted in 1971, and we know it and remember it not because of its adherence to facts, but because it is hard. Like really, really hard. The realism was central to this game's design, and it allowed players who oftentimes didn't even survive for 15 minutes to nonetheless come up with some concrete lessons about the hard-won realities of the era. I doubt I even made it that far. But is it possible to have too much reality? Minnesota Educational Computing Consortium, Freedom, and that's the same company, by the way, that made Oregon Trail, followed this up in 1993 with a game that was set in the antebellum South, where players assume the role of an enslaved African American attempting to reach freedom. The game's mechanics were equally as hard as those, trying to find my cursor here again. Equally as hard as those of Oregon Trail, and it came under fire for a number of reasons. The primary one being its adherence to vernacular that they claim they pulled from the historical record, vernacular that now we would assume with cultural insensitivity at best, racism at worst. I bring this up because it dovetails so well with the closest thing we have to a next-gen Oregon Trail, WNET's Mission US series. It's a game that the NEH funded at various stages, and a game that's in use now in millions of classrooms around the world. Composed of a series of chapters set across American history, Mission US gives players an opportunity to, excuse me, my notes are just getting completely cut off, to play through key interludes in US history, making the choices, shaping the decisions, making the big and small types of decisions that led to the American historical record. As for the promise, research so far has been encouraging. And this is directly from Leah Potter, who's the educational director at Electric Fun Stuff. A game like Mission US deepens students' historical knowledge by including increased historic vocabulary, understanding of perspectives, chronological ordering, all of the sorts of things that we know matters in terms of understanding how the humanities work in the classroom. But it also ran into its own problem. And this isn't necessarily a positive thing to some. Flight to Freedom ran into some trouble. This is the second chapter over the last couple of years because of the agency it allowed players in playing as an escaped enslaved girl on the Underground Railroad. A similar charge was given to Mission US's fourth mission, A Cheyenne Odyssey, which allowed players to take on the role of a girl on the Trail of Tears as she witnessed the destruction of both her homeland and the migration of her people and the destruction of her culture. The difference with these games, and it's a fundamental difference I think that's happening in the field at this point, is that the charges leveled against these projects were in some ways refuted by the process that they were designed through. Each of the games in Mission US, every chapter that we've seen so far, has a substantial group of humanities advisors that is backing the content and helping design it and boundary it from the outset. These games also come with a substantial group of curriculum materials, those that in some ways have helped to refute some of these charges down the line. Now things get trickier though when we start to talk about games that are based in space, historical space, lived space, real space. Another NEH project that's worth mentioning here is called Traveling While Black. And while it's still very much in its early stages, in its prototyping stages, the goal of this game is to allow players or travelers, wherever they may be, to access the Green Handbook, a book that was essential to African Americans in the Jim Crow South, and even in Jim Crow era North, as they navigated the space of the US, attempting to find places where racial animosity and violence could not touch them, or at least where they'd be somewhat sheltered by like-minded people. Drama in the Delta, another prototype project that came out about 8 or 9 years ago from Emily Roxworthy at UCSD, also attempts to really play with this idea of choice, of choosing which space to go to, of allowing the player to make decisions. But in this context, you're in a Japanese internment camp down in Alabama itself. And the small day-to-day decisions, the physical ones, the emotional ones, the cultural ones, the ones that allowed you to survive, are tested out and played through here in what was at the time an adaptation of Second Life. So to kind of step back and take a larger point here, contingency and choice, though we've seen them in the games that I just mentioned, do not necessarily need to be tied to historicity to be accurate. Indeed, sometimes they are more accurate when they aren't tied to history at all. And I bring this up in the context of Paper Police, a small independent game that broke through a couple years ago that allows players to play as a border patrol agent in a fictional dystopian country, screening different passengers as they attempt to enter the country. Some are straightforward, like a young child seeking refuge. Others, like an older man who has connections to a previous regime, are not. But as the choices are made and the games coalesce, as things begin to snowball, and you as a player have to begin to start deciding whether to separate families in order to keep your approval rating up with your supervisor, to turn someone back who's simply seeking food and risk not receiving that promotion, the takeaways become profound in a way that I think isn't possible necessarily if we look at this through a particularly through the scope of historical fidelity. But even so, it's obvious that there's something to the tensions between accuracy and choice. Can a player fully choose their course of play if they are bound, again, to this historical record? Some games would say yes. The Pox Hunter, a prototype in development from Lisa Rosner out of Stockton College, allows players to look at 18th century Philadelphia and the outbreak of smallpox that took place there. Based almost entirely on the historical record, on death records, on census, on stuff that's found in the Philadelphia College of Medicine's archive. This game allows for players to decide how best to tackle smallpox as it infests the city. In some sense, and you can see it right over here, it looks a bit like a strategy game. But in reality, it's something more. Because what the game asks players to do isn't to master any science. You don't sit there in a lab playing around with a petri dish, trying to figure out the best combination of pathogens in order to create a vaccine. But what you do instead is you navigate the social and cultural sphere. You move your way up and down the ladder. You have to figure out how to talk to elites in the city, as well as dock workers, who were predominantly African American at the time. And in order to fully stop this spread, you had to figure out an inroads to each of those communities and a way to get them to communicate across themselves, to gain trust, but also in some ways gain access to their networks. Now, anyone want to take a guess what happened when the game team realized they actually reached an endpoint where players could get to this? They found themselves actually completely going against the historical record itself. And Rosner, who's versed in the social and cultural pathology of diseases like this, went back and actually looked at what happened in Philadelphia newspapers. And she found that once viruses and inoculation reaches a certain point, guess what happens? People get lazy. They forget. They stop. They decide that they don't need this anymore because herd immunity has somehow dictated that their survival is going to be a definite thing. The game opens itself back up again once you reach that point. And it allows for a different social dimension to take hold once you realize you're talking to people who already know the efficacy of the vaccine, the scale of the disease. But it also allows players something interesting. Because rather than just play through the game with this idea of inoculating Philadelphia, they can see what happens if, say, for example, the underclass is inoculated and the elite suffer. Or what happens in the end if you don't allow anyone outside of a select few to gain access to the vaccine. This is the kind of stuff that's defined more broadly as counterfactual thinking. And I'd mentioned it before as something that's key to understanding game design and learning in the humanities. Counterfactual thinking, as Elizabeth Bonsignor defined it a few years ago, can be described as imagining what might have been, or the consideration of what-if alternatives to specific events. It can be a powerful learning tool that fosters investigative reasoning across multiple disciplines, including science, history, and business. A game I worked on some time ago actually played with this idea of counterfactuality by tapping into the archives of the Library of Congress and its patent unit, more specifically. There was a couple of factual, historical fires within that space about 100 years ago that remain to this day unsolved. We used that as the premise of our game that allowed for players to fill in those gaps as to what might have happened, to dig through actual patents from Walt Whitman, Henry David Thoreau, Clara Barton, and sort through what sort of dynamics might have existed at the time and how they may have impacted a technology that's now threatening humanity. In counterfactual scenario gaps like this, they're used for positive spaces for interactions. But what happens when the gaps in the historical record are unknown, but are rather so repressed or so individuated that they are difficult to see in any sort of granulated way? 1979 Revolution is a game that poses that question up front and center. Designed by Naveed Kansari and based on his actual family experiences in Iran at the time of the revolution, the game presents itself as an interactive documentary, true to the spaces and places where the history itself happened, and true to the actual archival evidence of that history as it took place in 1978 in Yala Square, where a massacre took place, a riot broke out, and the country broke itself. The game allows players to actually go through the historical record as means of accessing hints through the game. It even gives them the chance to uncover and unlock tapes that were passed around as bootlegs on the black market through the resistance from the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was at that time seen as a hero. These tapes, however, push further than that. They give players access to a bevy of museum materials and artifacts, and also give them direction as to where their player can go within that space. Another game that models this sort of documentary thinking is called Attentat 1942, just recently won a game at Games for Change. And it essentially is the story of the Czechoslovakia during World War II. The trials, the tragedies, the difficulties in surviving at the time. What's interesting about this, though, is how directly this brings us into contact with those who made and suffered through history. This couple, for example, who's in the game, who's playing through their house, playing music, cooking dinner, and receives a knock on the door from the Gestapo, allows you to, on the one hand, make the choices that they made at the time. Do you let them in? Do you hide your passport? Do you speak loudly to them? Do you acquiesce to their demands? But then upon completing it, it does something interesting. It makes you look directly at them. It makes you listen to their words. It forces eye contact upon you, staring at them and the living reality of their experiences and those who perpetrated them. Now, a different way of looking at this sort of historical dimension occurs in another project that, again, had some NEH funding, but is in many ways a model for what could potentially be taking place in terms of engaging history, but also the historical process, is Peter Dermanwelian's Digital Giza. And it's an attempt, in some sense, to capture centuries of experience, human progress, human regress on the Giza Plateau. It models the pyramids, it models the plateaus there, the graveyards, the burial sites. It models the Sphinx, but it also models every single tunnel in those spaces. It models the tunnels under those spaces. It uses sonar and ultrasound as a way of mapping that out and giving archaeologists for the first time the ability to actually wander through there. Now, of course, there's a AAA corollary to this, Discovery Tour, Assassin's Creed, Ancient Egypt, a more high-profile version of this work. And it's one that reuses assets from the game Assassin's Creed Origins, where players are given the chance to explore the whole of ancient Egypt. Its people, places, objects, work, culture. And this includes, of course, witnessing a mummification ritual, as you'd imagine it might. Yet reaction to the installment was mixed. On the one hand, critics and teachers marveled at the level of detail and production values present in the game. It's also quite an example of just how isolated those things can be when they're removed from any larger historical context or any sort of narrative. Digital Giza also allows for these kind of experiences, but it offers another, more deeply historical way of designing its spaces. That's because Digital Giza isn't just about capturing the history of the plateau, preserving it digitally for future audiences and future generations to appreciate as it becomes more and more imperiled, but it also captures the way that history's changed over time. Because the project allows you to time slide, to shift back to when the plateau itself was used in ancient Egypt, but also when it was, say, discovered by Howard Carter, George Resner, the folks who we associate with the birth of Egyptology. It allows you to see the plateau as it has degraded over time as well, through looting, through war. Dermanwelian sees this as a way of positioning digital cultural repatriation. In other words, of using digital spaces and using their design as a way of returning cultural heritage to a certain people. The project has a partnership with the Egypt Antiquities Board, for example, their cultural ministry. And it has several people who are working on it that ensure, in some ways, that these artifacts remain themselves, remain fully themselves, remain part of that country, part of their expressions. Which brings us finally to part 2 here. And as might be obvious already, stories in some ways are partially central to much of what we're seeing in humanities games and experiences. But so far we've only considered stories rooted in history. But what about the stories we tell ourselves? The stories found in film, books, radio, even games. Now, of course, this brings us to The Great Gatsby, or at least the adaptation of The Great Gatsby as a game. Purported to be released in 1990 and found in a garage sale, the game gives players the chance to play as a swashbuckling Nick Carraway, battling his way through mansions and hordes of butlers and flappers in order to reach Gatsby, who's awaiting him at some point, somewhere in the game space. And it even has the coda. But as you likely know, and some of you are giggling at this, the game, or at least its release, was a fake. Pulled together by a handful of designers responding to the farcity of such an exercise and other games like The Very Real Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which has you facing off against a giant octopus, dinosaurs, and playing essentially a cheap knockoff of Mega Man, was released in 1989 as an NES game, or how do we pronounce it now? NES? What was the new thing? It was just discovered, in fact. Twitter had it solved, sorry. I digress. Or, maybe more closely to it, another literary adaptation that I'm actually quite fond of, the sequel, the direct sequel to Fahrenheit 451, co-written by Ray Bradbury, that took place directly after the events of the first novel. Now, whereas Tom Sawyer leaned far too far to the game side of development, you might say Fahrenheit 451 relied a little bit too much with text for player experience. All right, there's a lot of text in this game. So what does it mean then, if we're looking at these examples, some of which are completely flip, to design for accuracy in a game adaptation of a literary text? To answer that partially, I want to turn to what's probably, at least contemporarily, the most well-known example of this type of dynamic. Walden, a game, from Tracy Fullerton out at USC. Based on an incredible array of Thoreau's own personal writings, his manuscripts, his letters, his journals, but also the artifacts that were found, whoops, got a blank one in here, at the space of Walden Pond itself, arrowheads, the remnants of his cabin, the flora, the fauna there. The game attempted to give players a chance to slide into the role and the perspective of Henry David Thoreau, balancing inspiration with sustenance in his first year at Walden Pond. So you can either spend your time gathering wood to build a cabin, or you can step back, chase after a fox, and wind up watching the sunrise over Walden Pond itself. Now, the key dynamic of the game is an interesting one, because if you spend too much time foraging for berries, too much time building fires, darning your clothes, taking care of the material side of your life, the game fades in color. It pulls itself back. The music that was once swelling dissipates. Your character begins to move slower. The world literally loses its luster. If, however, you climb a tree, climb a hillside, pull out your copy of the Odyssey, sit by Walden Pond, skate on Walden Pond in the winter, the music swells. You begin to see things that weren't there before. Your character moves faster, but he also seems sharper. Now, a lot of this had to do with the meshing of what different perspectives Thoreau brought to his own life. This is a close reading, a textual analysis of Walden itself, but also the basis for it. Thoreau saw the world in terms that are foreign to us at this stage. He did not differentiate between the humanities and the sciences. When he located, for example, a new species of bird, he called it by its scientific name, or he looked up that name, but he also described it poetically. That difference, that fundamental divider that we premise ourselves on so proudly these days, is erased in this project. Now, Thoreau spent a good portion of his life actually making a living as a surveyor and a pencil maker at one point, if you didn't know that either. His family had a pencil making business. Thoreau had this idea for revolutionizing pencils, and they actually turned out to be pretty darn good. But he made ends meet by surveying his own land, and it distanced him a sense from it. It gave him a real sense that no matter how close and no matter how rooted he was to his environment, the realities of the outside world always intruded. The game gives you a chance to play through that too, to explore what it feels like to give up on that side of your life, to not have hope for inspiration, and choose the realities of sustenance over that. Now, another novel that makes for an odd sort of game, or it's a short story in actuality, is Jorge Luis Borges' The Intruder. Now, this is an early piece of interactive fiction, but it really nails home some of the same points that Walden did. As a short story, The Intruder is rather sparse, it's rather unknown in Borges' catalog. It's a simple story on some level, although with all things Borges it's not, about two brothers who are fighting over a woman and wind up killing her. The Intruder, a tale told in 10 games, essentially adapts that story using classic video game tropes, like the one you see for Pong here. As you bounce the ball back and forth, words from the book are read. As you move this vase over here to catch different words falling, it's also read. But then you start to move into a different space, one where the brothers are fighting, but you notice the woman in the background in danger of being hit by either gunfire or a football tackle. By the time you reach the 8th or 9th minigame, something profound begins to happen. You begin to play as the woman, but instead of jumping over these potholes here, which you can do endlessly, 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 you realize that in order to progress, you have to throw her into them. You have to, in the end, as she's running away, attempt to kill her yourself. You're implicated in a way that the text suggests but doesn't allow for. This is, in some sense, an interesting dynamic that reflects a larger theory put forth by Walter Ong quite some time ago now in a book called Orality and Literacy. Ong argued that as the way that we communicate profoundly shapes the way that we view ourselves. Our shift to writing, for example, from oral cultures allowed for a more interior way of us expressing ourselves. It allowed for literature. It allowed for interiority to become the main criteria for how we begin to view human experience and humankind. But for oral histories, he viewed fluidity as the primary way of being. The idea that once a story is told, it naturally changes, naturally undergoes some sort of transformation. While there's structural similarities intact, an oral culture is premised on change. This is a great context to talk about another recent game called Never Alone. Upper One Games production, team that used to work on Tomb Raider, as a matter of fact, partnered with a tribe up in Cook Inlet to essentially save their history, to save their culture, to save their mythos. It tells the story of an Inupiat girl and her fox who are lost in the Arctic. It plays out ostensibly as a platformer, but it does something interesting and unique, both in its design and in the process that led to its design. It seeks to tie together the past and the present through a process that aligns itself entirely with that culture's oral history. Because rather than simply adapt these myths, then take the characters, take the creatures, take the settings that are essential to the Inupiat culture, never alone worked with the tribal elders to retell them at their request. In fact, as one tribal elder recalled, these stories will die if we don't figure out a way to retell them. We need them to speak to the next generation. We need them to be in their voice. The puzzles in the game aren't solved by any sort of ingenuity. They're solved by relying on the myths themselves. Roadblocks in the game aren't solved by going to wiki pages and actually figuring out how somebody went through this, although I'm sure there exists at that point, but by drawing from footage of the elders speaking about these myths, speaking about their interpretation in this culture, speaking about ways that these stories continue to speak and have relevancy to future generations. So I'm running short on time, so I'm going to speed up here through the keynote and just offer a couple, or the conclusions, and just offer a couple smaller points. When I first decided to do this talk, there was a couple of ways that I was going to actually approach it. One was to actually give you a behind-the-scenes peek at some of the stuff that I can share as far as our background goes with NEH. We are unique as a funder in that we allow for our projects that we fund and that we don't fund, even that come in as applications, to be co-productions. So I'll work with a number of game designers over the course of the year to figure out best ways at content, scholarship, game mechanics, approaches, things like that. But most of this stuff is still tucked away behind NDAs and confidentiality agreements. And what I could reveal, I think, is best revealed by some of the designers themselves who are out there, and some who are even in this audience. So it occurred to me that an interesting point was made when I started to dig through some of the records of where NEH has funded games. And as this quote suggests, before we started funding these games, NEH prided itself as an organization that did not fund fiction. We did not fund dramatic film. We did not fund the production of fictional texts, literature, that sort of thing. But games are our cheat. Because in all games, even in our most accurate states, they're all exercises in a certain sort of fiction, and that they want to include and accommodate player choice and player engagement as at least part of the rule set. The historical record bends here to an extent, but it doesn't break. But we can push even further towards a different way of viewing the humanities in games, one that attempts to create an experience in itself through the gameplay. In Walden, for example, the game's camera often directs a player's attention to different vantage point, views, vistas, such as this one, which suggests that you have the opportunity to go ice skating, or this one, which compels you to row across a pond. In other words, they force you to consider this aspect of reflecting upon the space, to slow down, to stop moving, to just pause, to look. For lack of a better term, I call these moments grace notes, because they aren't essential to winning, but because they are, nonetheless, perhaps every bit as important to the game. Even more so. And what's remarkable about this, and it's remarkable in some ways because I believe it does bleed from the humanities, is that grace notes are becoming a central part of an awful lot of our gameplay. We can see it happening in more action-oriented games like Uncharted or Tomb Raider. But the recent Legend of Zelda Breath into the Wild revels in this at every single turn. The game even has a camera system built in that encourages you to take shots of these spaces, to capture them, to contemplate these moments of grace, and to just pause. The humanities opens up all of human experience as potential play spaces, even those that involve reflecting on those spaces themselves. But as these quick examples have suggested, engaging the humanities through games is oftentimes as much of a winnowing of potential content, a winnowing through content experts, of boundarying a historical space, as it is exploring all of human experience, as the title might suggest. In other words, sometimes it's more profound to look through a keyhole than through a door. And in creating and designing humanities games for learning, we have to be careful about the fact that we do have access to so much of the record, so much that's known, so much historical expertise, cultural expertise, the expressiveness of human capabilities. Because what's really oftentimes the most profound thing is to simply stop, look, and pause. I'll stop there. I'll take some questions. And I'll end and pause right there. Thank you. Questions, comments? We can dig into some of the nitty-gritty if you want to at this point, but yeah.
My brain just exploded. I just did, I'm a filmmaker, finished a documentary when Christopher Columbus arrived, who were the Native Americans that
Excuse me.
annihilated. So that story.
Yeah.
To see how this can be an interactive way of telling that story.
No, and thank you for bringing that up, because filmmakers have been doing this sort of thing for years, right? And they discovered fairly early on just how dangerous it was to leave out some of those stakeholders. So Cheyenne Odyssey, Mission US, number of the games that are here actually directly involve those whose story it is to tell. And I think that's so crucial to this process, but it does mean another process in some ways. So for Never Alone, for example, this meant extending what would normally be the standard game development process, the iterative design process, to accommodate for tribal discussion, deliberation, the longer, slower, more focused and measured way of talking about a space or a story or a decision than what we generally arrive on. That presents real problems, and I've seen that across the NEH's work, but also outside of this field, that aligning a project, keeping it alive in that way, while continuing to maintain stakeholder interaction is really, really hard. But nonetheless, we have to do it. It matters. Yeah?
Okay, a quick one. I thought, so certainly as a designer, one of the key challenges we have with history games is trying to figure out what role the player can play, so that we don't project ourselves into historic roles that we just can't, like that we would misinterpret. I'm curious, when you're thinking about the roles that a player takes on in a historical game, if you've come up with any kind of little rubrics for thinking through that historical interpretation process.
I was going to include something like that, but it's difficult for us sometimes, since we can't be prescriptive as of the NEH, too prescriptive at least, as to what we want or expect to be successful. But yeah, I mean, there's a couple general rules of thumb. One, the stronger, broader historical figures are more or less off limits. And we've seen games that have been designed around those that completely violate the historical record almost immediately and give the player no sense of immersion or any sense of agency, since they know essentially where they have to go to, even if that's outside of the scope of the game. Two, adding multiple perspectives from the ground up seems to be the key. So what I've seen in that direction, and I think you know this as well too, in your own work, is that actually taking from the historical record certain smaller known tales. There's a great story of underground slave ad, or escaped slave ad, excuse me, that wound up making its way through newspapers in the South. No one could figure out its provenance, no one could figure out quite where it was from, which slave it was referring to, or who, for example, that slave at one point was owned by. Turns out it was a fabrication placed by the escaped enslaved person themselves to throw off the trail of those who were attempting to find him, to throw off the trail of those who would, in some ways, force them back into that kind of labor. Those are the kind of stories and those are the kind of perspectives that I think matter. I think figuring out ways into the untraditional, the ones that have some sense of surprise remaining in them, matters. You and I can talk more specifically about where you're going with some of this, because I know you're working on a project right now too. But I would say that not, in some sense, creating a game that allows you, for example, to play as a Cheyenne who's about to see the entire devastation of their culture is a distancing effort, right? I mean, it is a way of bringing you closer to that history, but also, in some sense, giving you choices and giving you a safe space to explore those choices in. That distances you from that. There is no tried and true method, though. And there are certain topics that I think scholars won't touch, and I think we should listen to them on that side. But we can talk about that a bit more. That's a roundabout way of trying not to be too descriptive here with that. Yeah, go ahead.
In terms of literary adaptation, what do you feel is, how do you evaluate a successful project along those lines? Like, do you have some things that you funded that you wouldn't want to show us that are?
I mean, it's tough to say. You know, I'd say this. The bottom line is this: what we ask for, and what I think really works, and there's a reason why I showed games that were outside of NEH through this whole thing, is that this idea of interpretation matters really heavily. It matters with how we deal with history. It matters with how we deal with philosophy. It matters, and that in some sense, what we're seeing from the literary games that do break through is that interpretation is not only front and center with what you can do as a player, but more profoundly, it's front and center to the game itself, to its whole strictures, to the environment, to what's allowed there, to the way that the player walks, the way that in Walden, for example, you are encouraged to walk, because Thoreau spent 8 hours a day walking and reading and writing and doing that kind of thing. So if the game space isn't an interpretation of the core set of the novel, or the poem, or whatever it may be, I think you're kind of lost from the beginning. But no, there's no tried and true set here. And I think there is going to be space for something like, say, an Everjane, which I think some of you may know about. We didn't fund this, but it just broke through about a year ago, and crowd-sourced funding, excuse me. It's an adaptation of Jane Austen's work that focuses specifically on the social aspects of her novels. So instead of going out and declaring war on another family and attempting to financially ruin them, you attempt to figure out a way to not get them invited to this party while getting yourself in the front door. Those are core interpretations. They don't always work on some level, but they need to be there on another in order for this to matter. I think it's a difficult thing when you start talking too much about figuring out ways of incorporating text into a project. Walden, interestingly, does it, in that by the time you finish that game and you play through and you dig through everything, you'll have encountered the majority of Walden itself, but also an entire volume of his letters to his family, his friends, the books that he's read himself while he was living on Walden Pond, and his correspondences with larger entities like the US government and spaces like that. So these things matter in their details, but they really fundamentally matter in their interpretive aspects. So that's, again, an it depends type of answer, but it really does here. I mean, that's the beauty of the breadth of some of these games that we're seeing. Yeah.
I've been out of the classroom for a long time. Is NEH still doing stuff with its Edcitement?
We are.
Are you putting any gaming stuff into Edcitement as a free link?
Well, yep. So one thing that I thought I had a slide here for it, but I don't. Walden a game is free to everyone who's in an educational space. If you can make a case for that, let me just throw it up here. You can get a copy of the game. If you go here to waldengame.com. Yep, I see that. I see it. All right. Can everyone see that? waldengame.com/educators. I hope everyone in this room gets a copy of it. Whoops. There's a great curriculum guide that was just funded too at some pretty substantial cost to the development team by Journeys in Film. That is an extraordinary way of positioning this game as a hub in the classroom. We've begun to dig into some of the evaluative work of this game, and in many ways it's fascinating because Walden itself is being used in traditional classrooms, but also homeschool settings. It's being used in after-school programs, but also prisons. It's being used in juvenile detention centers, but also as a core of an IEP for special education students.